Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ariane Cruz, and I am one of two philanthropy fellows at Philanthropy New York supporting its Justice Reform Working Group. Philanthropy New York is a membership of philanthropic organizations within the New York City metropolitan area. As an educator and a convener, PNY works to embed the values of learning, equity, community, and leadership in all that we do. It is with those values in mind that we are excited to partner with media impact funders to bring you today's program, the Philly DA, Advancing Criminal Legal Reform from the Inside Out. Naturally, this program would not be possible without the energy and interest you all bring to this conversation. So thank you so much for making the time to join with us today. Today's program will begin with an introduction to our panel, followed by a brief screening of the Philly DA series trailer. We will then dive into a moderated discussion and view a few more clips from the series. With that said, it is my pleasure to pass the virtual mic to our moderator for today's program, Vince Stell, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders.
Thanks very much, Ariane, for that introduction. And I am Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders. Really pleased to be bringing this program to you today. So thanks to our speakers and thanks to anybody watching today. And in the future, we're going to be recording this and sharing this broadly with our network for future reference. But it's really a great time to be hearing about this project. It's a program that we first encountered almost a year ago now at the Sundance Film Festival, and it was one of the most notable films that we experienced there. The first part of the series was a part of the festival, and we couldn't wait to learn more about it, and ultimately were able to watch the full 8-part series on PBS. And then just recently, this month, here in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, the Philly DA of the title, was reelected in a landslide victory, which consolidated his power as the district attorney, doing remarkable things in a department that was really had a different tradition than the one he brought. So I want to thank everybody for coming together. We've got a great panel to discuss this. One of the three filmmakers is with us, Yoni Brook. He's producer and director of Philly DA. Hugh Hogan is executive director of the Van Ameringen Foundation, and Nyoka Acevedo is with the Andrus Family Fund, as well as Chi-Wei Yang, who is one of the initial funders of the film, working with Just Films at the Ford Foundation. And because we're talking about a great movie project, one of the movie stars of this film, Philly DA, Latonya Myers, who is an activist and a featured subject of the film. So now, knowing all the players in today's discussion, let's start with a trailer to get a feel for the project altogether.
I rejected a long time ago that the only purpose of the criminal justice system is to punish.
Voters in Philadelphia have chosen a progressive as their new district attorney.
The most stunning upset.
Sending political shockwaves across the country. I am a career civil rights lawyer, the only attorney in the history of this city to overturn 800 convictions by corrupt police officers.
Krasner is a hero to some and a bum to others.
He's never been pro-law enforcement.
If things aren't working from the inside, you need to bring someone from the outside.
What do you think he's trying to accomplish?
Anarchy.
At this point, there are more people of color in prison or on parole than in slavery at the end of the Civil War.
Larry is bringing in criminologists, activists.
Everything we do, steady fire, heavy resistance. This will be controversial.
Policies that focus on rehabilitation and second chances as opposed to punishment.
We're in Philadelphia and there's murders and robberies. Community services maybe not appropriate.
This DA's office has been too close and too cozy with the Fraternal Order of Police.
How corrupt do you think the city is?
Anybody who's dealt with this office knows there are secrets. We need to find out where the secrets are.
You gotta be kidding me.
What is it?
All about police officers.
There has not been prosecution of police misconduct by this DA's office for 30 years.
Right now, Philly police officers think the scales are suddenly weighed down in favor of criminals.
If you're too corrupt to testify in court, you're too corrupt to patrol the streets.
Who was DA when there were dozens of people shot over the weekend?
I was.
We're tired, and we want our neighborhood back.
When you try to make the right decisions, I'll live with the rest.
There's a meaningless, endless cycle. A cycle of trauma, a cycle of pain. Some of the effects can be irreversible.
There's no mass incarceration. That's utterly ridiculous.
Not one cop is going to tell you that he's on our team.
Well, I suggest you don't shoot unarmed people in the back.
The DA's office is not a place a social experiment should be conducted.
You don't have to destroy the system to get the results you want.
Okay, Yoni, can you join us on screen?
Hi.
It's always such a great reminder to watch that trailer of just how rich and in some ways frightening this series is. As somebody who lives in Philadelphia, it's very unsettling, but also enlightening to see what you've got there. Can you just tell us how you got to the project? You have two important partners, and maybe introduce them and how you guys came together to make this film.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that, and for hosting this whole forum to discuss it and dig into it. It's a unique opportunity to do that sort of after the fact. We began, and when I say we, it's myself, Ted Passon, and Nicole Salazar are the three co-creators of the project. The project began pretty organically in 2017. Both Ted and myself live in Philadelphia, and we started seeing signs around town for a district attorney's election. And that was, Larry Krasner's name was on it. And Ted in particular, who's lived in Philadelphia a lot longer than I have, knew Larry Krasner by name and reputation. He was sort of the guy whose phone number you would write in a Sharpie on your arm before you would go to a protest where you might get arrested. So although Ted had never met Larry, Larry's reputation for defending Black Lives Matter, defending ACT UP, preceded him. And I think the idea that Larry Krasner would be the district attorney seemed a little bit shocking, maybe more like a stunt than a legitimate platform. That was just to us as outsiders. And so when Ted asked me if I wanted to help film Larry's campaign, I think we were thinking of it perhaps more as a short film. Look at the interesting issues when somebody campaigns to end mass incarceration from the office that a lot of scholars say is directly responsible for mass incarceration in the United States. So I think we thought it would be a short. When Larry Krasner won first the primary and then the general election, the conversation changed, because then the conversation for us became, well, can he do any of this stuff that he campaigned on? What are going to be the structural impediments to getting it done? And we, as filmmakers, had to kind of figure out how to tell that story. There was no playbook to make a film about a district attorney's office. The ACLU calls them the black box of criminal justice, because anybody can go into a courtroom and see kind of what happens there, but the decisions that are made by a prosecutor are done in secret. So to some extent, we started hanging out as much as we could in Larry Krasner's DA's office to understand what the power of a district attorney's office could be. And also to understand it as perhaps as a policy apparatus, not just the person who you see on the nightly news stand up to talk about the, whatever tragic crime of the week is, but to understand that they are shaping policies that affect hundreds of thousands of people, some more disproportionately than others. And it really spanned everything from the death penalty to probation and parole, police violence. Everything was on the table. And so as we started seeing these meetings play out in the district attorney's office, we started asking ourselves, well, who are the people who are affected by these policies.
Yeah.
And also not to see it as a one-way relationship where it's just the prosecutor making decisions and it trickles down, but to see that actually the prosecutor, who seems all powerful, there's actually a deep relationship and interconnectedness to other people who have power, whether it's police officers, city council people, but also activists and directly impacted people who he has to answer to.
Let me stop you there, because you're laying out a really remarkable array of issues and topics. And one of the things that I'm struck by most directly is you've described it as a black box. It's a big box, and it's a black box, but you put the Klieg lights into that box and lit it up. And one of the things that I think anybody is most struck by is getting behind the scenes, getting inside the doors and inside with incredible access to the candidate, and then and all sides of a fractious political debate, where people who you had very frank and I think forthright comments from his opponents, both in the campaign and also within his own office. So maybe if you could just say, like, how did you get so much light into the black box of access to so many intimate conversations?
I mean, the real answer to it is that when we started the project, Ted and myself were based out of Ted's production office, which is across the street from the district attorney's office. So we could look out the window and see the DA's office. It was very convenient. It meant that we didn't need a lot of money, quite frankly, to start, which is always the tricky thing with media projects, because people want to see, what do you have?
Yeah.
And I think we wanted to know what we could get. And so by being so close, it allowed us to just show up and hang out. And we never had, I would say, a formal invitation from the DA's office to make this project. I mean, Larry Krasner certainly understood what we were interested in, and he was clear that our needs were that we have complete editorial control and that we were going to show the good and bad that happened.
Yeah.
And I think he bought into that idea that this project could serve in some way as a report card, as a guiding post for other cities that might be going through something similar. So he bought into that idea, and we kind of just leveraged his buy-in to show up almost every day for the first 6 months. And that meant that we would sort of wander into the DA's office. We would put on ties to kind of look like attorneys, and we would wander the halls and talk to people. And a lot of the people did not want to be filmed because they either, were on Larry's team and had a lot more on their mind than their image in the media.
Yeah.
And other folks who had been there for 20, 30 years were very suspicious of what our motives were. Could we actually convey their opinions in a way that wasn't demeaning or belittling? And so,
and of course, you
spent
didn't
a lot
get
of time
in,
trying to build that trust, with them.
and of course, you didn't get into every room, and you even show a few times when the door closes to indicate that. But you got, I mean, it was an 8-hour series, which is long enough, but presumably hundreds of hours more in the vault.
Yeah, and that's a good point, in that there was a lot of stuff legally we couldn't see. A lot of ongoing cases were privileged information, but there was a lot of other, and quite honestly, our first instinct when we started making the film was, can we make this film? Pennsylvania has some of the worst laws on filming
Open
in
access.
Courtrooms, audio, open access. It's terrible. And I think Ted and I said, we can't make this film if we can't be in the courtroom. But as we started to hang out and understand the power of policy, and in a way, once we started to leave the DA's office and meet the city council folks who controlled the budget, meet the police officers who had their own ideas of what justice looked like, and then meet people who were in some ways caught up in it or other ways trying to change it through other avenues, did we realize that there was another type of project that could be made that would hopefully be, it's a tricky thing to say entertaining about something that's so serious and kind of detrimental to our society. But I think we wanted to make it accessible to people. And, and
well, there's no
certain
question it's very
accessibility to do
watchable. I mean, it's appealing, or entertaining is probably not the right word for it, but you're hung on the edge of your seat and waiting for the next episode for sure. I should say I'll have questions, but also anybody who's listening today, any of the other participants can drop a question in, as well as attendees. So we'll keep an eye on the Q&A and the chat box to see if anybody does want to offer their own questions. Anybody, feel free. But I want to maybe shift to, I think for us, it's really interesting to see what's the role of philanthropy in helping to make this happen, and also what can philanthropy do with media like this? How can it inform the wider work of philanthropy, as well as our ability to fund and support this work? How can we use the information? So let's start with the, and we're going to hear from one of your direct funders momentarily, but just maybe there's a lot of funding. There's a lot of different voices. We know that the Wincote Foundation and the Independence Public Media Foundation were two, I think, early supporters. Can you say a little bit about the range of funding you've gotten and the role of funding?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the funding piece of this project was really crucial creatively in a strange way, because we didn't set out to make an 8-part docuseries. We didn't sort of come up with this concept and then say, let's go shop this around Hollywood and see who will greenlight it and give us the money to go do it. We were making a feature film for the first 2 years, I would say. And because of that, we sought out funders in the feature film space that I think were very comfortable with us shooting a lot and exploring a lot. And I think we knew the spine would be Larry Krasner's office. It would be the role of the prosecutor's office. But I think approaching those feature film funders was really helpful. So some of the first funding that we applied to and received was from the San Francisco Film Society. And then the IDA, International Documentary Association, has a partnership with MacArthur to support enterprise, longer form journalism inspired projects. And then just films as well at the Ford Foundation. And then actually going out to the Sundance Institute, where they have a Catalyst program, where we were able to meet other philanthropists who I think were really interested in our exploring. And so that meant that we had almost 2 years to film almost every day. And then also we were editing simultaneously to that, beginning to string out what the stories could be, to think about what a 90-minute feature film would be like, but then also to really start having serious conversations about how we could not leave some of the most interesting stories on the cutting room floor. How could we develop them in an episodic way?
Well, I think it'll be interesting to hear how you pivoted from feature film to series, but why don't we take an opportunity to bring Chi-Wei Yang in, Senior Program Officer at Just Films, which is part of the Creativity and Free Expression Department of the Ford Foundation. Chi-Wei, thanks for joining us today, and thanks for your part in making this all happen. Maybe from your perspective, what did you see and when did you see it, and when did you get into this project?
Sure. Great to be here. Thanks, Vince. Congratulations, Yoni, again, on all the nominations that are coming through for the series. When we began speaking with the team, I think in 2018, the potential was clear, and it was not just based upon the experience of the team, which we knew, or the access or the political relevance alone, but really I think what sold us was that their clear-eyed understanding of what, at a meta level, this series was about. And I remember our conversation when they said, this is a film about cultural shift within an institution. This is what happens when someone comes in and tries to change the culture of an institution. And that was continues to be a very live conversation within this country. What happens when the culture shifts within any institution? What kind of frictions and tensions and challenges come up? And that really, really resonated with us. And obviously there's, important, the political relevance of the DA's office and the work around criminal justice reform was very important, but that kind of core around culture shift was key too. And so that really sold us on it. And we came in with a production grant, for a feature-length film. We gave the grant, a bit more than we usually do for feature films, because we wanted to give the team a better room to run with and see what they could find and shoot. And over the course of over the next, I think, 3 years, we made 3 grants. We're able to marshal resources from different parts of the foundation to support the project. We eventually made another post-production grant to the project after it became a series to help close it out. And we brought in our gender, race, and ethnic justice team, and in particular our colleagues who work in criminal justice reform, to join the conversation as well and be a resource for the Philly DA team, but also just to be in conversation and really both think about how to, ask questions of them and really kind of test out what they're thinking, but also to help eventually bring the project to their set of grantees so that the film could be active within the networks of 4 grantees who are working in CJ reform.
Really interesting to see the different elements that you're able to bring to the table in a large, complex funding organization. You were going to say something additional.
And eventually the third grant that we made was not to Philly DA, but was resources from Just Films, our criminal justice arena, and also our presidential reserves to support a grant to ITVS, who was a producer of the film, the presenter on public television of the film, who have a multi-year campaign called Stars for Justice, which Philly DA was the centerpiece of. And this was a multi-year campaign to help think about a national conversation around criminal justice reform through local outcomes. And we wanted to be able to resource the outreach and engagement campaign as well. And so, able to support it on the back end also.
Great. Well, it's such a great example because it can show, as I was observing, that when you are a large enough organization, there are different parts of the organization that can support different elements of the gestation of the whole project. But I think it's also useful for different funders who may have a smaller or more narrow framework to say that, like, there's different parts of the experience that we can fund: research and development, production, post-production, impact and outreach, et cetera. So that's, I think, very useful to see. And it's a big enough project so that there's elements of all of that. So I wonder, is there anything else about the impact that you could say, the impact or outreach work? Jiwei.
Sure, absolutely. I think what's been really important to see is that how closely the team has been working with across the country at local levels and with movement-based advocacy organizations. I think that, and that's both through the campaign that the team has been doing, but also the work that ITVS has been doing too. And so I think that ultimately we often see that we need to be resourcing these campaigns in multiple places. Like, I think oftentimes the distributor might do a short-term impact campaign, which is, usually it's for awards and for recognition and for that kind of burst. ITVS is a different one in that I think they're looking for much longer tail impact, but oftentimes there's the resourcing of that short term, maybe within a 1-year window of the release, where it's going to hit the national spotlight, it's going to create the national discourse, but that's going big, broad, and wide. The drill down depth work is going to take time over the next few years. And that's both working with advocates, but also thinking about education, thinking about the long tail of where that's going to go. And the resourcing for that often goes back to the filmmakers who are really going to be carrying that for much longer term. And so I think the important piece is to think about where you might want to plug in the shorter term piece, the longer term kind of detail piece. And, and the partnerships and the impact are going to be quite different in these different arenas.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things, I'm sure this is the kind of thing that we should be talking about when we get back to Sundance, which we hope to do in the coming months. They're going to be in person, and we hope to be joining the discussions out there for that. I think one of the things we're hearing also is with the rise of the big platforms, the streaming platforms, Amazon and Netflix and everything like that, it changes the dynamic about how things are seen and how impact strategies unfold. And I think we've got a lot to do to think about how philanthropy works around that as well. But let's talk about the story. We can continue to touch on any of these points, but I want to move us to the next part of our discussion and bring in the story. I think there's so many personal stories, so many entrancing personal experiences in all of this. And one of the ones that really stands out is Latonya Myers, who's somebody we encounter in the Philadelphia DA office, but also has her own experience in the system too. So why don't we go to I think we have a clip or two to hear about Latonya's story, and then we'll bring her on to the discussion as well.
I'm getting ready to go to the probation office. impression is everything. Because all they know is what they reading on that paper. She don't know who I am for real. So, gotta make a good impression. She got my life in her hands. I make the wrong impression. She might make the wrong decision or the wrong assumption, you know? For a relationship, you can walk away. You can't walk away from this.
It was a couple days after my 12th birthday. I woke up that morning and my mom's boyfriend had took her bed and dragged it all the way down the steps. He was out of control. I thought that I could protect my mom. And I picked up like an air freshener can and I hit him with it. He went to a payphone, called the police. When I seen the cops, I thought that they would understand what was going on. I was charged with aggravated assault in the first degree.
Stop. Take you home.
That was the first time I ever was in jail. For 3 days, I didn't know where my mom was at. I didn't know if any of my family knew where I was at. I was just there. And I would cry so hard. Finally, my lawyer pulled me to the side and she says, your grandmom's here. You take this probation, you go home with your grandma today, or go back to jail for another 10 days to fight this case. I chose to go home with my grandma. I'm 29, and that first felony from when I was 12 years old is what it brings up time and time again. My only felony on my record that I shouldn't even have. Instead of getting protected, I got prosecuted.
Latonya, can you join us on the screen? There you are. Great. I'm just so struck by the intimate, personal story that you're offering to share in this film project. And so thank you for that, opening your life up to all of us to understand something that is really just I think, not an issue that most people understand as deeply. So what if you could just start by sharing your experience in the film. What was that like for you to have suddenly cameras with you while you're putting on a tie and doing private things and private thoughts that you're sharing?
Well, Vince, I say thank you so much for this question, and I thank everybody that made this film possible. When I came home with a purpose, with a passion to really dispel those negative stigmas that was attached to so many people within my community. So I think I had more so of a tunnel vision. I wasn't used to cameras following me, but at that point, I knew that there was so many people that needed to hear and see that we can be a part of the solution and not just be named as the problem. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to focus on, representing my community and my family in a way where it would be respected and understood that we want the same things as everyone else. We want to be respected. We want opportunities. We can go from a defendant to a defender. And I was really motivated to inspire a young lady or a young man somewhere in America or internationally not to give up, to find the strength to speak truth to power. So it took a little getting used to it as far as the cameras, but I think my tunnel vision and really seeing a bigger picture to inspire and also give a better perspective as to what's going on the ground and the struggles that we go through was my main motivation to come across as authentic and transparent as possible.
And we join you in your journey. It's difficult, but then you have a personal triumph in this story too. So it's really great to see you work through and get to the other side of that in the court experience. This is also, I understand, transformed your own life and activism. The experience of the film, what impact has it had on what you're able to do now beyond just the capturing your story? How has it been able to actually propel you forward?
It has given, like, we on the ground, it was already energy, you know, being like with Larry running for office. But since the film, I've been, you know, seeing people just walk into the store, or, you know, people that I haven't seen in years that's incarcerated, because this film actually, everyone in state facilities across Pennsylvania was able to watch this film and really see exactly what was going on and see exactly what ways that communities was showing up. So, you know, people that serving life sentences was calling their moms and their grandmas, telling them to make sure you vote for Larry Krasner because we need this guy in office, even though they didn't have the right to vote. So I seen people in my community really becoming civically engaged and really understanding that we deserve and have a seat at the table and speak truth to power and not be afraid of it. And how can we come together as a community to dispel those negative stigmas, but also hold them accountable for the hurt and pain that they was perpetuating in our community. So it kind of gave us a tool, and it boosted us to give us the strength that we need to, like, see exactly what we need to do as a community to come together to put a stop to the harm that was happening to us in these programs.
So there's a couple of things I want to explore with you. One is once the Larry Krasner takes over, it's not like, okay, carte blanche, he just gets to do whatever he wants. He's still got to push to get reform. And the role of the activist outside is not just to warmly embrace him and just, it continues to be a need for outside activism to even push him, not just as an ally, but to force change as well, right? Is that, as I understand it?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. I think Yoni said it the best. When we start to understand the power in policy and starting to understand exactly what different roles that our elected officials play, right? Like, so we have Larry Krasner as the district attorney, but we also have judges, and we also have senators that's passing dangerous legislation. So when we start learning about that, and I went to Harrisburg for my very first time to testify at the Judiciary Committee, and I spoke from my heart. You know, I didn't know who these people was really until I left. But now we're having conversations with our state senators and our state representatives. So I think that it really allowed us to not just think, we know now that there's not one person that's going to come save us, that the power of the community, that us collectively holding people accountable, and also knowing who's stopping who from getting what done, you know, as Larry, you know, put forth policies that judges was really reluctant to follow, you know. So now we started to understand that, hey, we elect our judges too. So now we're paying more attention to our judiciary elections, like, you know, with the judges, and holding them accountable for the sentencing and the lack of support on progressive policies that Larry was trying to put forth, but also, you know, educating Larry on just understanding the tone of the community and how we can work together.
It's a great lesson. I wonder if you could just say—
I just wanted to add one thing.
Yeah, please.
And one thing that the conversation I had with Larry was like, hey, as a district attorney, you're not just here to prosecute us, but you're here to protect us as well. And that's from the harm of certain obstruction of justice that's creating these climates within our community. So let's go after those guys too.
And if you could just say a word about your own organization, what is it? Where could people learn more about your own activism?
Well, thank you so much. I run an organization called Above All Odds, and I'm the founder and CEO of it. What we do is we try to address the underlying issues like housing scarcity. We was able to provide up to $23,000 in assistance for individuals that was coming home to actually have a home to come to. That's the foundation of, you know, some people come home and then they find themselves in particular situations. So we do civic engagement we're creating a formerly incarcerated voters block so that we can come up and really show out in these elections and hold individuals accountable. And I'm just so proud of the work that Above All Odds is doing, that's led by formerly impacted individuals, to really speak truth to power and be supported within the community to have the long-term impactful effects that we need and all. So I thank y'all, and if anyone wants to learn more about it, and I thank Yoni and Ted and Nicole for allowing me to be a part of the filmmaking process and really understanding the power of storytelling and really doing it in a responsible way. I remember being in the editor room and, learning about different things and just having that understanding. So I thank them, and, we hope to continue to really dispel those negative stigmas and learn exactly how we can project the power of storytelling in a way where we can drive change in a direction that we're looking for in our nation in a progressive way.
That's great. Well, I think your experience and your insight actually is a great segue to a conversation I want to bring Nyoka Acevedo and Hugh Hogan into, to get the other funder perspectives on these issues and what they see in your experience and in the full series, and what lessons for philanthropy. So Nyoka, if you want to join us as well on camera, I want to turn to you and ask you, Nyoka's with the Andrus Family Fund and a program officer there. Would you like to reflect on some of the issues that Latonya has offered? And Latonya, you could stay on screen if you want.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Vince, and thank you all for the invitation to be in conversation with you all today. I think Latonya's story highlights what we know. The system is inherently racist, right? And it's like rooted in a white supremacist structure. The fact that a 12-year-old can be charged with a felony is absurd. It's criminal. Right? It is criminal that a 12-year-old can be charged with a felony, that young people are only given one chance, and not all young people, but very intentionally Black and Brown young people are only given one chance. And we know this to be true because we know the data supports that the carceral system, that Black and white folks commit crimes at the same rate, and Black folks are more likely to be sentenced to jail and prison for those crimes, right? So we have the data to support the fact that these systems, should be abolished, right? And that this story, the Larry Krasner story, it's about an individual, but it's also a story about a community. It's about a community that's, the organizations in Philly that have been doing the work to put forth a progressive DA with the understanding that a progressive DA will reduce the harm, right? And so Latonya spoke about accountability. It's not only about prosecuting, but she said also protecting. And so wanting to lift that piece as well. And so I think Larry Krasner and getting progressive DAs in office is really about telling the story and telling the narrative about how to reduce the harm on the way to abolition. And the role of funders is to support that. Our role is to support narrative change, to support the narrative ecosystem, to support the grassroots and community organizations, leading the way for change and ensuring that young people aren't incarcerated, particularly young Black and Brown folks aren't incarcerated, and interrupting these systems. Our role as funders are to support organizations that are disruptors. And I'll stop there because I know my colleague Hugh has tons to share as well. So I don't want to take up too much space.
It's a conversation. Appreciate those comments. And you, do you want to jump in here? I know you're a big fan of the program too. You could feel free to rave about it. It is an amazing film.
I did. So Vince, like you and others on the Zoom, I've seen a lot of social change media in my time in philanthropy and before, when I was part of the environmental justice movement and sort of third world political ecology movements. And there's a lot of stuff that is painful to get through. This was terrific. It's sort of The Wire meets The Morning Show. meets Lone Star. And I'm recommending it to lots of colleagues and as the basis to teach about racial injustice in the United States, because I think the perspectives that become stereotypes in the course of the series, date to 1619. When enslaved African Americans came to this country, and the ideas, you hear them spoken in the series, you realize that this really started and has built over many decades and indeed centuries to get us where we are. So I think my job was to share. We are at the Van Ameringen Funder, a proud 70-year funder. It's a family foundation. We have several, the majority of our board members are now in Philadelphia from the Kind family, and we fund at the intersection of poverty and mental health. And so the context, part of the context here is that when the Reagan administration finished the process of deinstitutionalizing people with significant and persistent mental illness, there was supposed to be a plan to create new institutions that would help people heal and get the mental health supports that they needed. That did not happen. We were in the beginning of a now 40-year plus history of, as Grover Norquist said at the time that Ronald Reagan was elected, we're not just going to toss the baby of government out with the bathwater, we're going to choke the baby. So all the things that were promised on the anti-poverty front, on the mental health front, on the economic justice front, on the jobs front, on the education front, have all been cut and cut and cut. And so prisons and jails became our de facto mental health institutions, particularly for poor people. So many of the people in the communities that Latonya comes from can't get the healthcare that they need. And many of people that in the communities that Latonya comes from can't get the jobs or training or education. You hear the young prosecutor that's named as the head of the juvenile division eventually say, look, people in the communities that Latonya comes from, the last thing is they want is to be less safe. But what they also want are good schools and rec centers and opportunities for young people like Latonya. And this is the deep and abiding and profound, structural racism and racial injustice of this country. And that leads us to what I really agree with Nyoka. Watching what I've watched in my time in philanthropy, we need to get on a path of not just reform, but abolishment. We need to train people, we need to educate people, we need to rehabilitate people, which is not to minimize what happens to the victims of crime, but how do we peel the onion to say we should never have two guys that walk into a GameStop to do what they did to that police officer, right? That we should, as a society, be able to allocate resources and wealth in a way that never has to happen. And if it does happen, that we have rehabilitative ways to deal with it and just ways to deal with it. And I think that's one of the messages lost in that episode is like, those guys lost any hope of ever seeing daylight again and going into our prison system, which is not a pleasant place.
Yeah.
So I think, in terms of Philly, it's one of our 10 biggest cities in America. It has the highest concentration of poverty. Until recently, as DA Krasner says, it was the most incarcerated city. And I think that stat of 40,000 people on probation in a city the size of Philly, New York City is 10 times the size of that, and there was only 12,000 people under institutional supervision.
Yeah.
So, and another stat we get from the Billy Bail Fund is people who are not convicted of a crime, who are held pre-trial, are held for an average of 271 days. As Latonya says in one of the episodes, she lost her job, she lost family members, and she could do nothing about it. So I think really what the film for me, I hope will spark is a really much deeper discussion of how we got to where we are, why we continue to be in that place, and really look at the kind of deeper reforms that the DA has been leading on. And as Nyoka said, this is not just the story of a man who rode in on his white horse, far from it. He himself says repeatedly in the series, look, the movement wants this. I think what's so compelling about him, and I think about people like Angela Davis and Michael Ratner, he was uncompromising. He said, this is a culture and an institution of structural racism, and I'm gonna change that. And he's the person at the top when junior staffers come to him says, no, we're not gonna do it that way. We're not gonna seek the death penalty, as painful as it is what happened to that police officer. These are tough decisions. I think that's what's really compelling about it.
Really comes through. You know, I'm so glad you said that. I think it's also really frustrating over the last several months to see debates over the structure of racism in American judicial and criminal justice systems being sort of caricatured in a politicized debate where they talk about critical race theory and turn it into a kind of a negative bumper sticker in a political framework where nobody even defends the idea that actually racism is deeply imbued in the structures of our criminal justice system. And I think we can all agree with that, but actually they were able to characterize that in a way that when they took it into the Virginia governor's race, nobody even defended it. Everybody said, we don't teach that in elementary school. And rather than saying, yeah, this actually illuminates a real problem in society and advance the idea that actually, you know, what you can see in this film series is actually racism is imbued in the system, and we need to illuminate that and eradicate that. I was really disappointed that nobody actually came out and said, yes, critical race theory or some aspect of the, I just wonder if anybody would like to reflect on taking a more positive approach to advancing these ideas and not like defending them, saying, well, we don't teach them to kids. You, Nyoka, anyone?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fundamental the fundamental tenet of critical race theory is to say that racism is real and it dates to the founding. And if we have that as our starting assumption, we can have a much more honest discussion about, you know, what comes out in the film, what white people are afraid of and why they've been taught to be afraid of and why. I grew up in one of those communities. I know how it was done to me. And as a gay man, I just had a different consciousness to know, like, wow, something doesn't add up here. I think, you know, I think I'm less interested because of what's happened to the word sustainability and critical race theory of having a political discussion of that. And I would rather, as funders, we keep it on the reality. What struck me in the film as well was Latonya talks about being on probation for 10 years. I can tell you from the site visits I've done in the last 5 years and previously in my gig at the North Star Fund in New York City, if you look at how long people are on probation versus how long people who are lucky enough to get into a mental health treatment program or a substance use treatment program or an education program, how long they are tracked once they've completed the program or when they re-enter after being incarcerated, how long do they get support? You talk to the best providers and it's a month or two at best. So we have built a system that tracks people like Latonya and expects her to check in once a week for 10 years for something that happened when she was 12 to defend her mother. If she went into a mental health treatment program in the United States, whether it's Philly, New York, or any other big city, you know how long she would be followed up with and supported? Probably at the most 6 months to know if she was okay.
Right.
We need to change that fundamentally.
Great.
Also, sorry.
Yeah, please. No, that's fine.
I think Hugh is right on, you know, and the only thing I would add to that is I think as funders, it's also important to fund narrative infrastructure, right? And so the Larry Krasner story is important because it's part of a larger narrative. You know, the reason why Latonya is able to be criminalized at 12 is because of the super predator narrative that comes out of the Clinton era, right?
Yeah.
That somehow we adultify young Black and brown children. And so when we do that, we remove their humanity. And so we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, the counter narrative to the super predator narrative, right? And we know that those narratives are shaped in community. And so I think our role as funders is to really think about like, how are we supporting these counter narratives at varying levels? And so I know Chue spoke about, you know, funding film production. I think it's important for us to, you know, as funders, you know, with the organizations that we support to ensure that they have communications capacity and really think about, you know, support at varying levels to support these counter narratives as we're pushing back against whatever the boogie monster of the season is, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm just struck by the counterbalance of that is the infantilization of a 17-year-old who takes a long gun and active shooter style, kills people on screen. There's no doubt about it. And they treat him like a blubbering infant. You know, it's a totally different way of handling the subject. I wonder if you just have. Oh, I just want to ask Nyoka to mention. Hold that thought for just a second. Nyoka, can you mention an example of an organization engaged in narrative change that you have supported? Is there something, a grant?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, at a large scale, we support Color of Change. And Color of Change is leading, you know, some of the most groundbreaking narrative in terms of, you know, like interrupting, you know, racism within the tech industry. So looking at how algorithms are allowing, you know, white supremacists to function and thrive. And so I'll just use that as one large example. We also have No Kids in Prisons. And I'll dig up the link and drop that in the chat for folks, which is an experiential experience, online digital experience that talks about why we need to abolish youth jails and prisons. And so I think those are both examples of how, you know, narrative is being used to win hearts and minds and to interrupt.
That's great, because I think it's so important to be able to point to the specific opportunities related to the concepts. But sorry to hold you back there, Chiwe. You wanted to say something?
Oh no, this is just, it's such a good conversation. And you know, one thing, there's, you know, on the theme of abolition within media making, there is a growing conversation around what does it mean to make abolitionist media? You know, what kind of accountability do filmmakers have to the form and the structures of filmmaking? Because so much of, you know, I think commercial media making is complicit, as Nyoka said, in advancing a lot of damaging narratives. And I think the question is for funders is, who are you supporting and what kind of filmmaking style are they advancing? You know, I think that there's a great essay called A Proposition on True Crime written by Brett Story for the journal World Records. And, you know, she talks about how the success of the true crime genre is really troubling in that it reifies this notion of innocence, but at the expense of not questioning the idea of guilt. Why do we find people guilty? That's not being questioned, because these genres just peddle in finding people being innocent. You know, and so I think that I think part of this is to think about what filmmakers are working outside of their controlling narratives, you know, that Nyoka is talking about, and who is breaking the form, and really thinking about media that is both, you know, when we think about critical race theory, a corollary is media literacy. You know, we need to be able to have the public to be able to really see through and understand what they're looking at, to decode it for themselves so that they do not take these narratives and absorb them and reproduce them again. So it's on the audience, but it's also on the filmmakers themselves, like Yoni, to show complexity, you know, and to show the true breadth of all the different players that are involved in propping up this system. That's the way that we can understand it. But few projects have the vision and also the sort of like the scope to be able to do that. And instead, it's reduced to a couple, you know, binaries, which really doesn't allow us to understand, you know, how to address the situation.
Can I just add to what you were saying? I think what really struck me, what Yoni said at the beginning, you know, I had 2 years, my colleague Ted and I had 2 years just to be creative. We had a foundation that was willing, or a funder that was a financier of feature films that was willing to just give us time to be creative. I mean, that almost never happens in philanthropy. Like, you get a grant to do pre-production or production or some distribution. Very little usually goes to education and actually doing something with the film. So I think the real lesson of this series is there was some serendipity for Yoni being Ted's office was across the street from the DA's office. But also there were funders willing to give them what they needed to do this over time and do it right. And I think that's really a lesson from this series, is that you have to adequately, if you're going to pick a piece of the pre-production to distribution and education, fund it as generously as you can, and don't nickel and dime people who are coming to you, particularly if
great advice for sure. You know, I'll just say, I think that that's true what you said about how people generally approach it, but I think that the field is becoming more sophisticated and more differentiated. And so you do have leaders like the Catapult Fund who are really contributing to research at the front end and growing that sector. So you've got research and development and production. It's a more varied space, but for sure, most funders don't see it that way. They just see it's a production grant. What else would I give? But anyway, thanks for that. I do think that it's such a great project. We should take another look, because I think a clip that we have about Krasner himself in the work illustrates some of the points that we've raised here. So why don't we, if we have that clip, take a look at the man in office, and then we can talk about it a little bit more afterwards too.
They didn't do a damn thing in this office in terms of changing these policies for 30 effing years. We were going to do a phased rollout of improvement of bail practices. For right now, phase 1, let's see what we can do around SAM, small amounts of marijuana, sex work, retail theft, and I think we can move quickly to a bail policy recommending that there be no cash bail, and tell them it's coming.
We're starting with a small list of mainly non-violent, low-level offenses. So our top charge is possession with intent to deliver.
Yeah, marijuana, right here.
Then DUI, retail theft, simple assault. This list of 33 charges accounts for 51% of all arrests.
Within the office, we can make sure we engage the old guard folks and have them be a part of the team.
We take all those people who are less than 10,000 bail and turn them into releases where it's appropriate.
That's a dramatic shift.
Pennsylvania is not going to pass a law requiring that cash not be part of bail. That's never happening. But what we can do at the local level is that the district attorney can make recommendations, because DAs have a lot of discretion.
We'll have to nitpick, because some things that are low bail, the public despises. One example, identity theft. And that's going to be what everybody's talking about.
Everybody always talks in these terms of like what the public thinks or doesn't think. I'll tell you what the public's going to think. If they see a lot less people in jail for dumb stuff, they're going to think that's good.
Great. So Yoni, maybe we'll start with you and say, like, I know there's a lot more to say about that. Is there anything, you know, you had to stop filming at some point. Is there any update of that part of the story, or the obviously he won re-election, so he must be doing something right. But anything that you'd like to say?
Yeah,
about
I'm going to
where
ask
we are?
Latonya to chime in as well on the cash bail issues. It's one of Latonya's areas of policy expertise.
Totally.
But certainly Larry Krasner did win re-election. But a lot of these issues, as you see here, with was sort of the first phase of bail reform, they're really knotty to unpack them. And certainly hearkening back to the conversation we just had about the narratives, one of the things we tried to do in the series is to kind of show on a series-wide level of how the narrative of fear in some ways is perpetuated by the local media, by existing other power structures, and something like cash bail, as has been seen in other jurisdictions like New York, is one of those things that's really scary for people to unpack because of sort of the way they've been acculturated to think about what justice looks like. And so, you know, now we're at the point, and this is where I'd love Latonya to educate better than I can, where, you know, some of those policies that seemed revolutionary 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when it was Krasner's first year, you know, you're seeing there is still cash bail in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And so how Larry Krasner navigates between the folks that helped put him into power and really propelled him into power, and also the limits of what his office can do is what we're seeing now happen in Philadelphia.
And maybe as I switch over to Latonya, I'll just interject. If anybody felt that, gee, how far can I go? I don't know whether I'll get reelected. He got reelected with a large majority. And so hopefully in the second term, he's able to use the political capital that says we can do the things we want to do, but we'll see about that. Latonya, do you want to reflect on where we are and where we need to be in cash bail?
Yes. right now, the Pennsylvania has a bill that has been swept through the House. Organizations like the Philly Bail Fund and the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund are being threatened to shut down because we are liberating people that can't purchase their freedom. So now they want us to have the same regulations as bail bonds. And we know bail bonds are there for profit. This is a community charity, right? And when you have people that's born into wealth, there's no regulations on how many times their mom or their dad or their pop can post bail for them. But because the community is coming together with the support of so many philanthropists and people, from all over the spectrum, understanding how important people's liberty and how we cannot put a price on individuals' freedom. We've been in that part of history before. We know it, how white supremacy just runs rapid through this criminal justice system. So we're fighting currently. We're actually trying to get our state senators to vote no on this bill that will actually further incarcerate people, make it harder for people to come home, and pull them away from the community support like Philadelphia Community Bail Fund and so many other bail funds across Pennsylvania are organizing to liberate people that have not been charged with any crime. So I understand that Larry ran on a platform to end cash bail, but he doesn't have the power to. This is, like Mr. Hugh said, this is a fight for power. This is a fight to continue to that people are profiting from. And because you don't own a slave physically today, don't mean that you're not perpetuating the same white supremacy and a harm, right? People, there's individuals that's, doing labor for 15 cents an hour. 15 cents an hour upstate, and I just hope that we all come together and use whatever power we can to make sure that organizations like the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund can continue to liberate people that's just held on in custody because they can't afford to post bail. Bail was $50 and $30 at times. It was a man 75 years old with pneumonia and on dialysis that was held on a $500 bail. We posted his bail, and he could have very much died under the conditions in the jails during COVID-19. He's not a flight. It's just because he couldn't afford the post bail. So I think that there's a lot that activists, and we're going to continue to fight to make sure that we don't go backwards, but move forward and pay attention to these bills that's being passed, that's quote unquote reform bills, but it's actually perpetuating more harm.
Yeah, and to the point that you made on the sort of modern day slavery of it, there's a very powerful book and film project from some years ago called Slavery by Another Name. Maybe we'll find a link to that. It's a very powerful film, easy way to get into that issue. But Latonya, your activism continues and your story continues. Do you have an intention to continue the filming on your own?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Vincent. Watching that series with my family and seeing how moved people throughout the nationally and internationally, was so invested, and I wanted to be revolutionary, vulnerable. I know some of the scenes is hard to watch, especially with your mother, but I also wanted to follow up, and, I was inspired by Ted and Yoni, and I was thankful that they was allow me to keep my story, to really tell my full story, the pain, the life after the pain, right? The life after the fight. And I think it's important for people to know, and what I would love to work on is a project where, we can really look at what it's like to learn how to be free. I haven't seen the Statue of Liberty yet. I want to go to different places and meet people that's in their community, and I want to heal with them. I want to, go zip lining and surfing, and I want to show that, we can heal beyond what happened to us in our past, and we can do it together, but also educate each other on what is happening in different states and how we can show up together, but also heal and move forward together.
Great idea.
Well, hey, let me know when you go ziplining so I can come with you on that.
Right.
Vince, can I just ask
you,
Roshni, to post the Philly Bail Fund? I'm delighted to say that my board approved a 3-year, $60,000 a year grant yesterday to the Philly Bail Fund to start to build a team of 9 peers like Latonya work in a healing justice frame, because the impacts of this, 50% of the people who were incarcerated in Philly, I think it was in 2020, were admitted to behavioral health services. So that can mean substance use treatment. It can mean mental health treatment, or likely both. 8% of those people had health insurance. None of them got therapy. So I think there's also a role for funders to play in building community institutions that begin at the grassroots, peopled by leaders like Latonya. And Latonya, thank you for being so vulnerable in the series. Like, to open yourself up, as Vince said, in that way is just so powerful, and something I know I could not do. And I'm just so proud of you and wish you continued strength in your activism and your leadership and in your life, and your brother. So I think there are ways, even if you're a direct service funder and not funding in the media space or funding in the activism and advocacy space, there are programs within these institutions that can really shift the lens. And we also just approved a grant to Philadelphia Mural Arts Advocates for their Porch Light project. This next year, it's going to be called, the project features an artist, a multimedia artist in Philadelphia, and a clinician who were focused on Black Paradise and Black Joy. And it's going to be a series of events of just the things that Latonya said. It's going to be dancing, it's going to be zip lining, it's going to be riding bikes in the city. And there will be resources about where people in low-income communities of color who are over-incarcerated, under-invested in, over-paroled, can go to find resources to heal.
This is so great to hear you. Thank you for these fresh and encouraging contributions that you're making. I don't think we realized that the Van Ameringen Foundation had such a strong connection to Philadelphia, and so it's just really, makes it all the more rich, the connection between the story and what we can do about it. I see that there is a question from Carolyn Peters. What short-term institutional shifts do you hope to be inspired by the experiences highlighted in this film? And that's a question I think anybody can answer. Maybe we haven't heard from Nyoka for a few minutes. Do you have thoughts about short-term institutional shifts that and certainly anyone else can think about a response to?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What short-term institutional shifts do you hope would be inspired by experiences highlighted in the film? Are there things that institutions should do today and should not, like, okay, the fullness of time, like what should cash bail or any other immediate change that we should be calling for?
Yeah, I think from the funding perspective, I think we should move more towards trust-based philanthropy, continue to give multi-year support, continue to give unrestricted dollars so that the organizations on the ground who are best positioned to respond to the needs of the community are well-positioned and well-resourced to do so. So I think that's something it's an easy lift, it's a quick lift. And as philanthropists, that's really what we should be leaning into, multi-year unrestricted dollars for community organizations to be able to do what they do and respond to the needs of the moment.
Great. And Yoni, do you have any, I know that you are the filmmaker and your job is still to put the story out there and let people, but do you have any quick thoughts of the particular gaping holes that need to be filled?
I just think more diverse storytellers and the ecosystem is crucially important. I know Hugh is a big a proponent of that, but I think that is key.
Okay. And if any of you have questions for each other, I suspect that you might. You should feel free to voice them here. I think it's been a really rich discussion today, and we had a great planning call a little while ago too. So you should feel free to pipe in there as well. But I really appreciate the opportunity to cover so many different aspects of this project. It's a rich and varied kind of story that you've presented, but also reflects a lot of different ways that philanthropy can engage in the.
And if I can,
Yeah,
Vince, I would
please
also
do. Yeah.
love to shout out sort of the Continuing Impact campaign that's going on, which
Yeah.
really is a springboard from the PBS ITVS broadcast, which I think brought this series to over 500 local PBS stations. 98% of the American people could watch it. You know, they hosted, in collaboration with us, over 100 community screenings around the country, not just preaching to the choir, but you know, in lots of parts of the country that don't have a progressive DA that are still building capacity for something like that. They were talking about this series. And then what we've sort of done post broadcast is to engage with different organizations like the Doc Society's Threshold Foundation, WinCode, again, Independence Media, to really approach two different groups, both folks who are going to become the DAs and prosecutors of the future. So showing it at the Harvard Law Schools. There's an entire course being taught about Philly DA at Wake Forest University's law school next semester, going episode by episode to touch on it.
That's
and then
great.
also talking to folks that are like directly impacted, not necessarily to teach them from Philly DA, but to learn from them. So there's a program called Inside Out Exchange that works with college courses taught in prison. And there have been over 60 educators that are being trained using Philly DA to host conversations and classes inside with people who are incarcerated, and oftentimes those are the people who have the most to teach the practitioners about.
And these are all projects that are continuing to operate and could continue to benefit.
Yeah,
from
they're going to be going through 2022.
ongoing support.
Exactly.
Great. So there are opportunities to get involved going forward as well. Great. Anybody have any last thoughts? Yeah, Chiwen.
I had a question, Yoni. I'm curious about how the film has been received by folks from across the political spectrum, you know, say the Fraternal Order of Police or individuals who are supportive of the death penalty. I'm just curious about how you drew a very broad, complex portrait of a city and the many different players. You gave a lot of depth to folks from all different sides. But I'm curious about how the series was received from folks who were not necessarily supporters of Krasner.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think people who came into the series perhaps predisposed to agree with some of the policies that Larry is espousing. They gained new insight into like who's pushing back against him and what other forces they need to marshal to like really accomplish the dream that he campaigned on. But I would say from folks that didn't like Larry Krasner specifically as a politician, I'll put in a separate bucket from folks that were against some of his ideas. Folks who didn't like Larry Krasner as a politician, I think, found a lot in the series to reinforce why they don't like him. I think they saw sides of him that confirmed that he maybe wasn't suited to be what they thought a district attorney should be, both in temperament and other ways. And we as filmmakers didn't shy away from showing parts of him that maybe he wouldn't have wanted out there, but that's kind of the deal in terms of trying to paint a nuanced character. But then I think there were other folks in the institution, and we heard from judges, folks that work in the system, even from higher level political figures who I would say are more purple. They agree with some of the ideas, but also we're not ready to get on the train. That they found the series really helpful in understanding different modes of what justice can look like, and also understanding a little bit of what was behind some of the things that had been reduced to sound bites for the past 3 years on the evening news. So I think in that sense, I gained a lot of hope from those conversations, that people who stuck with the series could get a little bit more nuance than this like quote unquote idea of justice that they've been told exists for decades.
Well, I think there are reform candidates and reform DAs all over the country now. I think this series has a lot to teach those people trying to do the work and the communities trying to press for reform. I think you've taught us a lot. This was a really rich conversation. We're really happy to be able to host it with our colleagues at Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement and Philanthropy New York. I want to thank everyone, Yoni and Chiwe and Nyoka and you, as well as Latonya. Really appreciate your personal story. And we'll try to keep the conversation going after this. And hopefully we'll see people in person again one day, hopefully soon. We're going to be, we're aiming to be at Park City for Sundance next year, so stay tuned in our network for that. And we really appreciate how all the different funders have both supported the work, but also are now using the work to inform and influence ongoing support for activities on the ground in all different portfolios. So thank you all for joining the discussion.
Thank you, Vince.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.